What happens when the foundation of trust, the very bond that holds a family together, crumbles in the most unimaginable way? Imagine learning that the person you've called your best friend, the one you've shared countless moments with, the one you've confided in and leaned on for years, is the very person responsible for shattering everything you've ever known. That's exactly what happened to one pastor, a man whose life, faith, and family were built on an unwavering belief in loyalty and brotherhood. For years, he held a deep trust in his best friend, unaware that his world was about to be shattered by a truth so shocking, so life-altering, that it would unravel his entire existence. One simple DNA test. That was all it took. What started as a routine inquiry into the ancestry of his children would soon reveal a secret that no one could have ever imagined. His best friend, the one man he never thought would betray him, was the biological father of not just one, but both of his children. But that's where this story doesn't end. It's a truth that led to far more than broken trust. It set into motion a tragic series of events that would tear apart the lives of everyone involved. A brutal double murder that shocked not just a small, close-knit community, but the world as well. How could something so horrific happen between people who seemed so close, so trusting? What drives someone to commit such unimaginable violence against those they once called family? As we begin to untangle the pieces of this complex and devastating case, we'll explore the heartbreaking betrayal, the shocking revelation, and the deadly consequences that followed. Stay with me as we uncover the shocking details of a crime that will forever alter the lives of those left behind and leave you questioning the depths of human nature. In the quiet town of Birmingham, Alabama, Pastor Jonathan Matthews was a man everyone looked up to, a pillar of faith, a father figure, and a friend to those who needed him most. His unwavering dedication to his community earned him respect and love. But there was one man who knew him better than anyone else, his best friend, Alex Carter. They were more than friends. They were brothers. They had been through everything together, their bond unbreakable, their loyalty undeniable. But as in any story, there are always hidden layers, unseen cracks in the foundation. For Pastor Matthews, those cracks would soon emerge, and when they did, nothing would ever be the same again. It all started with a simple DNA test. A man of faith, someone who believed in the truth, Pastor Matthews had no reason to doubt his family, his life. The test was meant to be nothing more than a curiosity, a way to confirm what he already thought he knew. But what he uncovered in those results shattered everything. A single line on a piece of paper, and the truth, brutal and devastating, was laid bare. The results were undeniable. Alex Carter, his best friend, his brother, was the biological father of both of Pastor Matthews' children. The very man he had trusted with his life had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way possible. The betrayal cut deeper than Pastor Matthews could ever have imagined. Not only had his best friend broken his trust, but in doing so, he had destroyed the very fabric of his family. But this was just the beginning. In the aftermath of this shocking discovery, the unimaginable unfolded. Pastor Jonathan Matthews stared at the DNA test results, each word seeming to blur together as they burned into his mind. His children, his beloved son and daughter, were not his. The faces he had kissed goodnight, the children he had raised with love and devotion, had come from a man he trusted more than anyone else, his best friend, Alex Carter. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His world, everything he had ever built, was unraveling before his eyes. His first thought, his gut-wrenching, instinctive reaction, was to go to his wife Elaine to seek answers. Surely there was some mistake, some misunderstanding. He found her in the kitchen, standing by the sink, unaware of the storm brewing in the room. His heart pounded, his voice caught in his throat. How could he even begin to ask the questions that were racing in his mind? How could he confront her with this truth? But there was no holding back. He held up the paper, the proof of his children's true paternity, and simply asked, "How could you?" His voice cracked under the weight of the words. Elaine turned to him, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to explain herself. Her eyes, filled with regret, met his. She admitted to what had happened. An affair, years ago. A mistake that led to the children he had raised as his own. But the truth was far worse than he could have imagined. The man he had trusted most in this world, the one he had called his best friend, had not only betrayed him in the worst way possible, he had taken from him something irreplaceable. His family, his future, everything. In a flash, Jonathan's emotions spiraled out of control. His heart pounded in his chest as anger overtook him. The shock, the pain, and the rage twisted together, consuming him. How could she? How could she betray him like this with the very man who had been his closest friend? The frustration boiled over, and in a blind fit of rage, Jonathan struck out. A single, violent act, his hands around her throat, tightening with every thought of betrayal. Elaine collapsed, her body limp in his grasp. It was done. Elaine's body lay still on the floor, and the reality of what Jonathan had done hit him like a cold wave. He hadn't meant for this to happen. He hadn't meant for her to die. But the rage, the shock, the hurt, it had all led to this. The woman he once loved, the mother of his children, was now gone. But it didn't end there. Just as the weight of his actions began to settle in, there was a knock at the door. Jonathan froze, his breath catching in his throat. Who could it be now? He hadn't expected anyone. His heart raced, the room felt smaller, and then, as if the universe itself was playing some cruel game, he heard it again, the knock. Jonathan opened the door, and there stood Alex, his best friend, the man who had destroyed everything. Alex, with his innocent smile, unaware of the destruction inside. Jonathan's mind raced. He couldn't afford for Alex to leave, to live. Not now. Not with the truth between them. The truth that had shattered Jonathan's life. There was no turning back now. Jonathan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Alex's presence only reminded him of the betrayal that had already taken everything. The anger surged again, and the confrontation escalated quickly. Words became meaningless as rage overtook reason. Jonathan saw red. He could not let Alex leave. He had to act. In that moment, Jonathan's mind cleared with chilling precision. The DNA results had already shown Alex was the father. If the two were dead, if Alex was dead too, the investigation would focus on why they had both died. The DNA would confirm a secret affair, a hidden relationship that had torn everything apart. No one would suspect him. No one would think to look his way. The investigation would turn on itself, consumed by the twisted nature of their affair. Jonathan acted. He killed Alex swiftly, his hands steady, as the rage and the plan merged into one. The one man who could expose him was now gone. The scene was set. He cleaned up quickly, erasing every trace of his involvement. The bodies were placed to suggest a confrontation, an affair gone wrong. No one would suspect him. The perfect cover-up, the perfect escape. And then, he made the call. Jonathan dialed 911, his voice feigning shock, his words carefully measured. He raised the alarm, claiming he had stumbled upon the scene. The police would investigate, but the focus would shift to the affair. The affair that had gone wrong. The twisted confrontation. No one would see through the perfect mask Jonathan had created. As the investigation unfolded, Jonathan Matthews walked a fine line, playing the role of the grieving husband and father. But beneath the surface, the truth, the dark truth, was hidden in plain sight. And in the shadows, the lies would remain buried, at least for now. The price of his actions would weigh on him, but for the moment, the perfect crime had been committed. But the truth, like all truths, has a way of finding its way to the light. To better understand the complexity of this case, we turn to a panel of experts. Psychological insights, expert opinions, and the key findings of the investigation will shed light on the intricate web of betrayal, manipulation, and motives that shaped the tragic events surrounding Jonathan Matthews, Elaine, and Alex. Betrayal can be devastating, but the psychological response to betrayal, especially on the scale that Jonathan experienced, can be much more profound. When someone we trust betrays us, it shakes the foundation of our identity. In this case, Jonathan had trusted Alex for years. Alex wasn't just a friend, he was family. The realization that his children were not his own, the betrayal by the woman he loved, and the shock of discovering Alex's role, it's no surprise that Jonathan's reaction was extreme. His mental state was severely impacted, pushing him toward actions he might not have otherwise considered. The rage he felt wasn't just about the affair, it was about the fundamental betrayal of his identity. It's important to note that this kind of emotional turmoil often leads to poor decision-making, clouded judgment, and ultimately violence. Jonathan's response to Elaine's betrayal is consistent with a form of emotional dissonance, where the person's sense of self and reality crumbles under the weight of unbearable truth. For someone in Jonathan's position, the shock of discovering such a deep betrayal is often accompanied by feelings of humiliation and powerlessness. In this case, the tragedy of his children's true parentage could have been seen as the breaking point. His fit of rage toward Elaine wasn't premeditated. It was an emotional eruption. Once he took that irreversible step, however, the feeling of control likely gave him some solace. He might have believed that he could then control the narrative, control the investigation, and avoid the consequences of his actions. The investigation into the deaths of Elaine and Alex revealed several key aspects. First, the physical evidence at the crime scene, while seemingly pointing toward a confrontation, did not fully add up. The positioning of the bodies, the lack of forced entry into the house, and the absence of signs of a violent struggle raised questions. Could the deaths really have been the result of a spontaneous altercation, or was something more carefully planned? There was also the issue of timing. The 911 call was made at precisely the right moment, suggesting that Jonathan had carefully staged the scene. He was a man with control, perhaps too much control. Was this the work of a man pushed to the edge by betrayal, or was it a well-executed, calculated crime? Experts disagree. One theory that has emerged is that Jonathan may have felt cornered by the revelation of his children's true paternity. With the DNA test results now revealing the truth, the idea of the affair would have been brought up during the investigation, pointing to a deep, hidden relationship between Alex and Elaine. The discovery of this affair could have consumed the investigation, leading to theories of jealousy, rage, and revenge. Some speculate that Jonathan saw no other way to cover up his life's destruction than through the violent elimination of those involved. The deaths could be seen as a means to shift the investigation away from him, creating a narrative where Alex and Elaine's affair led to a tragic ending. However, there is another angle that hasn't been fully explored. What if Jonathan wasn't simply trying to cover up his own guilt? What if he felt that his entire life, his purpose, his identity had been stolen from him? The psychological impact of raising children who were not his own, only to have them taken away in such a cruel, heart-wrenching way, could have driven him to commit acts that defy explanation. There's a potential for deep-rooted psychological trauma, a breakdown of one's very sense of self. Perhaps Jonathan wasn't just trying to cover up a crime. Maybe he was trying to reclaim what was lost, to restore his sense of worth at any cost. It's the moment no one ever expects. The moment a family is ripped apart at its core, the foundations of trust shattered beyond repair. Pastor Jonathan Matthews, a man respected, revered, and beloved by his community, now stood at the center of a storm of his own making. His life, his family, his reputation, everything he had worked for, now hung by a thread, twisted by the revelations that had come to light. In one unthinkable act, Jonathan's entire world crumbled, and the world outside took notice. The victims of this tragedy are not just those whose lives were taken so violently, they are the family members left behind. Elaine, his wife, taken in an instant by the very hands that once promised to protect her. The children, his children, or so he had thought, who now faced a future turned upside down, their lives marred by betrayal. Jonathan's own children would be forced to reckon with the realization that their biological father was not the man who had raised them, that the love and security they had always known was built on a lie. Imagine the heartache, the disbelief. Imagine standing in the middle of the wreckage, surrounded by the ruins of your life, only to realize that everything you thought was true was nothing but a house of cards. For Jonathan Matthews, this was no hypothetical scenario. This was his reality. The walls of his faith, of his identity, had collapsed under the weight of a devastating truth, a truth that no sermon could have prepared him for. He had to reconcile the man he thought he was with the monster he had become. Could he even face himself in the mirror? As a pastor, Jonathan was supposed to be a beacon of guidance, a symbol of unwavering faith in the face of adversity. But when adversity struck his own life, when betrayal and violence shattered the very fabric of his existence, how could he possibly continue to lead? How could he reconcile the gospel of love and forgiveness with the anger and rage that had consumed him? How could he ever step back into the pulpit and offer solace when his own soul was so deeply torn? The emotional devastation Jonathan went through in those final days is something few could truly understand. His mind, a battleground between guilt, shame, and self-loathing, was a war he fought alone. He knew he could never undo what he had done. He knew he would never be able to take back the violence that had torn through his home. And as the investigation progressed, with all its meticulous details and painful revelations, Jonathan found himself trapped in a nightmare that had no escape. But what of the others? What of the people who had known Jonathan for years? What of the congregation that had looked up to him for guidance, for wisdom, for spiritual strength? What of the friends who had walked beside him, trusted him, loved him like family? The shock waves from the crime rippled outward, reaching every corner of the community. The church, once a sanctuary of peace and unity, was now a place of fractured trust and uncertainty. The very foundation of the congregation's faith in their leader was now in question. How could they continue to worship under the guidance of a man whose actions were so horrifying? For the community, this tragedy was nothing short of a betrayal. They had trusted Jonathan with their spiritual lives. They had trusted him to lead with integrity, with honesty, with compassion. But now that trust was shattered. Questions began to emerge. Could they still follow a man who had destroyed his own family? Could they still call him pastor? For some, the answer was a resounding no. For others, the shock was too great to process, leaving them in a state of stunned silence, unable to come to terms with the loss of their spiritual leader. The impact was felt most deeply by those closest to him, the congregation members who had witnessed Jonathan's transformation from a humble man of God to someone unrecognizable, someone they could no longer trust. The air of reverence that once surrounded him had been replaced by a suffocating cloud of uncertainty. For some, it would be impossible to reconcile the man they had once revered with the man accused of unspeakable crimes. And then there was the family, Jonathan's children. For them, the emotional toll was unbearable. What could they possibly have thought in the moments after the truth about their parentage was revealed? How could they look at their father after what he had done? How could they look at themselves, knowing that their lives were built on a lie? Their own identities, once so secure, now hung in the balance. And with the death of both Elaine and Alex, they were left with no answers, no closure, only a bitter void where once there had been love and trust. As the investigation unfolded, as the pieces of the puzzle were carefully examined, one thing became clear. The impact of this crime went far beyond the immediate victims. The emotional devastation reached into every corner of the Matthews family's world. It shattered lives in ways that could never be fully repaired. And the town, once a place of unity and shared faith, was now divided, left to pick up the broken pieces and try to find a way forward, if such a way even existed. What was the lasting impact on the community? Could it ever return to normal? Could the church ever heal from the wounds inflicted by its own pastor? For many, the answer was uncertain. Some clung to the hope that redemption could still be found, while others began to question the very foundation of their beliefs. Was this a warning? A sign of deeper, more hidden struggles within their community? Or was it just the tragic end to a story no one could have ever imagined? Weeks into the investigation, the police had run into a wall. The evidence at the crime scene was clear. 2 bodies, both lifeless, both showing signs of violence. But when it came to pinpointing a clear suspect, the detectives were stumped. Jonathan Matthews, the grieving husband, had been questioned thoroughly. But there was something about the scene that didn't sit right with them. The way the bodies were positioned, the lack of definitive evidence tying Jonathan to the crime, kept them questioning the truth. Despite the mounting evidence of a brutal crime, the detectives couldn't find the smoking gun they needed to build a solid case against Jonathan. No fingerprints, no DNA. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found. And as the investigation dragged on, the officers began to wonder, had someone deliberately wiped away all traces? Or was the killer just that careful? And then, just when they thought they had reached an impasse, something strange turned up. During a routine examination of Alex's body, a forensic technician uncovered a small piece of evidence hidden carefully in his clothing. A DNA test report, one that had been clearly placed there with intention. The lab results confirmed the shocking truth. Alex Carter, the best friend of the grieving pastor, was the biological father of Jonathan's children. The very children he had raised, the children he had loved, were not his own. This discovery threw the investigation into disarray. The report had been planted with such precision that it suggested a deeply hidden secret between the 2 men, a betrayal that was so much more than anyone had realized. With the DNA report now in their hands, the detectives couldn't help but think back to the way the bodies had been positioned, to the carefully orchestrated crime scene. Was this just an act of rage? Or had there been a much more complicated web of lies, jealousy, and deceit at play? As the investigators pondered the possibilities, their focus began to shift. Could this betrayal, this shocking revelation of an affair between Alex and Elaine, have triggered the violence? Was this all just a tragic consequence of a relationship gone wrong? And if so, who was responsible for the murders? The evidence, though still limited, was pointing in a direction that Jonathan never intended. The planted DNA report had shifted the investigation. Now the focus was on the affair between the pastor's wife and his best friend. The detectives couldn't ignore the implications. Was this some twisted act of revenge? Or was it something more calculated, something planned out by someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the evidence to cover their tracks? It was as though the more they dug into the details, the less they understood the true nature of the crime. Jonathan had always been one step ahead. But now, as the investigation unfolded, it was clear that the evidence, carefully planted, carefully hidden, was painting a different story. And with every twist in the case, the police found themselves entangled in a web of questions that they couldn't yet answer. This version adds more tension, and introduces the idea that Jonathan has been manipulating the investigation from the start by planting the DNA report on Alex's body, making it seem like the affair between Alex and Elaine could be the motive for the crime. The investigators, while suspicious, are unable to link Jonathan directly to the murders, keeping the mystery alive. Let me know if this works for you. As the investigation unfolds, one question remains. Was Pastor Jonathan Matthews right to murder both Elaine and Alex? If you were the investigator, how would you crack this case? What would be your next step? We want to know what you think. Was Pastor Jonathan justified in his actions, or is there something more to this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you were the investigator, how would you approach the evidence? If you want to stay updated on this case and hear more shocking true crime stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss an update.